And you're watching World Insight with me, Tian Wei. Still to come on our program. The U.S. has bowed out of several long-standing international treaties. What's next for everybody else? That discussion right after this break. You're watching World Insight. I'm Tian Wei. Since U.S. President Donald Trump took office, globalization and the multilateral foreign policy have been at the back burner. So far, the U.S. has withdrawn from 8 deals it has signed, yet Mr. Trump, with his American First policy, is far from done. He has waged a tariff war with most trading partners, and security concerns are growing across the world as many sees it.
The United States will withdraw.
The United States will withdraw.
The United States is officially withdrawing from the UN Human Rights Council.
From the Iran nuclear deal.
From the Paris Climate Accord. We're going to terminate the agreement. We're going to pull out.
Since Mr. Trump took office, he delivered on his campaign promises to pull the U.S. out of international deals he deemed unfair. In pursuit of the interest of the world's largest economy, he has decided to ditch long-standing commitments the U.S. has made with different partners. Some about trade, some about security. Most significantly, the U.S. has dropped the Global Compact on migrants and Paris Accord on climate change. By doing so, President Trump started the trend of anti-globalization, which encouraged nationalism and extremism around the world. A trade war between the world's largest economies has caused the growth of the global economy. And trade rules between the U.S. and its traditional allies have either been rewritten or renegotiated. When it comes to security, Russian President Vladimir Putin made an interesting metaphor.
As far as I remember, the coat of arms of the United States depicts a bald eagle. In one talon it holds 13 arrows, and in the other, an olive branch as a sign of a peaceful policy with 13 olives on it. Has your eagle already picked all the olives, so only arrows are left?
With the midterm elections getting close, the world is waiting for the U.S. to give a clear answer.
For more on the ever-going China-U.S. trade war, joining us in Beijing, Liu Baocheng, once again, Dean from the Center for International Business Ethics from University of International Business and Economics. In Washington, we are joined by Jeff Moon, International Trade and Government Affairs Consultant and former Assistant U.S. Trade Rep for China. And in Chicago, we have Da-Li Yang, Professor in the Department of Political Science at the University of Chicago. Welcome to three of you, gentlemen. Earlier, have you already noticed that we have a heated debate about the WTO reform and the interest of China, United States, everybody else in that 165 trade body. Things are more complicated than just the WTO, isn't it, Mr. Moon, that we see the Trump administration deciding on withdrawing from several international treaties and mechanisms. Will that process continue from your perspective?
Well, I suspect that it will. President Trump has said that he's not a globalist, that he does not believe in the multinational order, and so I suspect there will be more withdrawals. I'm not sure where, and I think, personally, I think that that's regrettable, but I think that process may continue.
That process may continue. Therefore, Professor Yang, everybody else has to adjust to that. After all, U.S. is the largest economy and one of the most influential countries in the world. But would that mean that everybody would have to sacrifice their interests to bring the U.S. back, even though whether that will bring the U.S. back or not is still a big question mark, Professor?
Well, certainly a lot is in the air, and certainly at the same time, there is a lot of talks among the different parties in seeking to strike new deals. And in fact, the Trump administration is not averse to new deals down the road, but it wants to actually stir the pot up quite a bit, certainly in this case, but in the hope also of getting something much better in the under the moniker of America First. So in that sense, actually, it's sort of this is truly a reset of the entire system.
Professor Liu, from your perspective, resetting the system, that's what Professor Yang just used, the phrase. Will everybody else in the international community also, follow suit in a way that they would withdraw from things that they don't like 100% and only remain in the bodies that they would like and enjoy the most from? Therefore, you will see a international mechanism and systems being, in a way, very different from previous days.
So I think it's a matter, whether we are taking a short-term deal approach or take a long-range approach. So immediately, it seems that the Trump administration is using a bullish manner to coerce and corner some of the countries for the benefit of the United States. But, I would advise that more countries would really see a longer term and to weigh the pros and cons of managing a multilateral trading system. So, compromise could be one, but a principle is there to be defended for this spirit.
Mr. Moon, which is likely to be more relevant? A international mechanism without the United States participating, but yet the other parties on the mechanism are still, to a certain extent, enjoying themselves, or totally without these international mechanisms, or bringing the United States once again back to these international mechanisms. Well, many of those remain on the platform from the very beginning, feeling they have to sacrifice a big deal in order to do that, which is likely to be more relevant. And according to the hard rules of international politics, which is likely to happen from your perspective, Mr. Moon?
Well, certainly the world community acting in concert is the preferable option. And I think that's what's going to happen in the end. It is the sovereign right of every nation to participate or not to participate in an international agreement. And in a number of the cases that we're talking about here, I think that it's a matter of updating, not fundamentally changing a lot of these agreements that are quite old and perhaps over time need to be updated a bit. So I'm optimistic that the negotiations will continue. It's not a matter of sacrificing, it's a matter of reaching consensus so that there is a benefit for all countries and that these organizations and agreements are relevant to all countries.
Professor Yang, among the international mechanism, treaties, and agreements that the U.S. withdrawn so far, you see so many different categories. Some are related to the United Nations, for example, UNESCO and others, but that is out of a dispute about the Palestinian-Israeli issue. You also see those that are actually international agreement or things that people have been working on for years, for example, the Iran nuclear deal, which the U.S. Earlier administration was certainly a participant and also signatory to. You also see different kinds of withdrawal by the current administration. It's very hard to generalize that the current administration is trying to update the international system, but rather it's a mixture of interests that we have seen from the actions. Professor Yang, whether my judgment is right or not, I would like to have your views as well.
Well, you're absolutely right. There are so many different things happening at the same time.
That's right.
So therefore, it's very difficult to have a simple rule. It just appears that the administration is willing to go along on many issues. But in fact, in certain aspects, for example, in terms of the climate treaty, the U.S. continues to decrease the use of coal for power generation and so on. So even without actually formal participation in the climate treaty, the trend is already set. In certain other areas, however, change, especially, for example, in terms of the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty, is going to be destabilizing. And in fact, it may unleash new forces, and it would be very, very challenging to deal with it. But there are also interest in saying that actually that there are violations and so on, and of course it may be outdated in terms of the new circumstances. So a lot of changes that are happening, and in certain cases it may be justified. In other cases, it may be actually quite destabilizing.
And therefore, Mr. Moon, one question can be legitimately asked. With the frequent political changes and the wind blowing in very different directions in Washington, This administration's decision and tendency might be very different from the next administration. We don't know when the next administration will happen, though. At least 4 or 8 years, we don't know. But so whether do we know or not where U.S. stands is a big question mark for many of the other countries. You know, they agree to something that the current administration proposed, but the next one comes in, might be thinking very differently. Can we accept a 4-year change of the international system every time? That's also a question mark, Mr. Moon.
Well, this also gets into matters of U.S. law. In matters of where the Senate has confirmed a treaty, it is much harder to change the U.S. position. There are other agreements that were negotiated during the Obama administration that were not treaties, and so therefore the U.S. president can change his position. I take your point that American policy needs to be consistent. I do think that this particular administration has prided itself on taking a very hard look at commitments and rethinking them, but the ability to change those commitments, as I said, very much depends on whether we have a treaty obligation or not.
Professor Liu, of course, we all know the elephant in the room, as we say, that is the relations between China and the United States. We really need to mention here rising power, incumbent power. U.S. feeling now China could be even termed as, quote unquote, the enemy or the adversary because it's strategically growing, and to the extent that Washington even feel feared about. Professor Liu, therefore, all the changes that we're talking about here, from the U.S. demand, it is looking at its self-interest. China, well, looking at its own self-interest, but at the same time, it's a rising power and therefore has to go with the rest of the world, unlike what the current administration in the United States is doing. So, Professor Liu, how will China keep that balance and be willing to keep that balance, Professor?
I think there is a fundamental difference in terms of the attitude. China does recognize that we have benefited fairly from the multilateral trading system, while the Trump administration says that all the rest of the world is really taking unfair advantage of the generosity of the United States. So China is now resolved to its own reform towards more market-driven economy, and in the same time keep open further of its door, and also particularly over the Belt and Road Initiative, China is really spreading the benefits they have received and the prosperity they created to many of those underdeveloped economies. So that's the right approach, particularly during the difficult time when the world is losing direction in the value system. So I think China is really standing on the right foot.
Mr. Moon, we are facing a world now with the U.S. probably taking the lead and awakening everybody else about looking at each other's weak points, suggesting, oh, they're all doing for their own national interests. With that in mind, how will the world be able to come to any consensus? After all, will threat be able to do the job, or will consensus be able to do the job? That's, in fact, a very ultimate question, Mr. Moon, particularly coming from the biggest power in the world. From your perspective, sir.
Well, today, with respect to the multilateral trading system, today in Ottawa, there is a meeting of 10 or more nations to talk about WTO reform. And that does not include a U.S. representative or a Chinese representative. So that conversation is already proceeding. I would distinguish that from the bilateral conversation between the U.S. and China. And it's very important to recognize that with respect to the bilateral relationship, we are at a very important inflection point.
Right.
For the first 3 decades of reform and opening up, we had complementary economies. China had low-cost labor that could be used with American industrial capacity. Now China, in this most recent decade, is emerging as a competitor. And the problems in the relationship that were always buried in that complementary relationship are now the entire relationship. And so this friction, which has been there all along, has now really come to the fore and really needs to be resolved in a way that was not the case before.
Before we go, less than a minute, Professor Yang, that bilateral, well, multilateral, how do you see the proceedings or the process of the discussions with these 2 tracks in a way, Professor Yang?
Well, it's always difficult to balance them, but it's extraordinarily important for leaders to be committed to improving the system in terms of reaching out, in terms of thinking about the global good, rather than just nationally. Of course, every country has to mind its own interest, but at the same time, especially for countries such as China and the United States, they are so big. Generally, they need to take more of a global leadership position.
All right. Dali Yang, Jeff Moon, Liu Baocheng, thank you so much for joining us.